When the dawn starts to creep back into the sky and it's time to leave, we can still feel the drum, and it's pulling us right back to where we begun. Reach up to the sky above, higher, like you can't get enough. Reach up, push the feeling higher, and then you bring it back.
See I wanna believe that I can reach inside your heart to where it bleeds. I see in your eyes signs of hard times, but then you smile, yeah, makes the darkness fade. Let's say goodbye to sorrow. I know we can fly, yeah, like there's no tomorrow, like there's no tomorrow. No
Standing here in silence, your hand inside my hand. Where have you been hiding while I made all the plans? Try so hard to take my eyes off you. I'm about to lose my common sense. The moment when you showed up, then I knew, oh my, here we go again. Are you coming back to my life after all we said and done? Are you coming back to my life? I thought that you were gone. Good reason, my mind says to my heart, still I want to keep her. Oh, why is this so hard? Try so hard to take my eyes off you. I'm about to lose my common sense. The moment when you showed up, then I knew, oh my, here we go again. Are you coming back to my life after all we said and done? Are you coming back to my life? I thought that you were gone. Try so hard to take my eyes off you. I'm about to lose my common sense. The moment when you showed up, then I knew, oh my, here we go again. Are you coming back to my life after all we said and done? Are you coming back to my life? I thought that you were gone. I thought that you were gone.
know you're the one I've been looking for, and I know you're the one for me. So baby, I'm reaching out for your love. If you really believe, if you really believe, if you really believe,
amazing together as one. Oh. There's no turning back for the both of us. No point of denying the truth. Let go of the past and get stronger. Just believe in the fire between us. Believe in me, believe in love. Believe in the fire between us. 'Cause it will be so heavenly. Just believe in the fire between us. Believe in the fire between us. Believe in the fire between us. I know what you're facing, I know what you fear. But soon you'll be ready, your mind will be clear. There's no turning back for the both of us. No point of denying the truth. Let go of the past and get stronger. Just believe in the fire between us. Believe in me, believe in love. Believe in the fire between us. 'Cause it will be so heavenly. Just believe in the fire between us. Believe in the fire between us. The love in our hearts is causing these flames. The will in our minds will keep them forever. Just believe in the fire between us. Just believe in the fire between us. Believe in me, believe in love. Believe in the fire between us. 'Cause it will be so heavenly. Just believe in the fire between us. Believe in me, believe in love. Believe in the fire between us. 'Cause it will be so heavenly. Just believe in the fire between us.
We can shine in a crowd, we never hesitate. Let us rise to the clouds. We got nothing to lose, I know the time is right. Let us light up the fuse. And I know, and I know, and I know, and I know we're perfect, you and I. And I don't, and I don't, and I don't, and I don't giving up without a fight. What I feel, I know it's right. Let us detonate tonight. Let us detonate tonight. Let us detonate tonight. We can shine in a crowd, we never hesitate. Let us rise to the clouds. We got nothing to lose, I know the time is right. Let us light up the fuse. And I know, and I know, and I know, and I know we're perfect, you and I. And I don't, and I don't, and I don't, and I don't giving up without a fight. What I feel, I know it's right. Let us detonate tonight. Let us detonate tonight. can't stay to see the lights fade away into the night. 'Cause you and I live day by day. As time goes by, it's the price we pay. Just close your eyes and we will rise at the speed of the sound. We're leaving ground in hyperspeed, in hyperspeed, in hyperspeed, in can't stay to see the lights fade away into the night. 'Cause you and I live day by day. As time goes by, it's the price we pay. Just close your eyes and we will rise at the speed of the sound. We're leaving ground in hyperspeed, in hyperspeed, in hyperspeed, in hyperspeed.
What kind of a feeling am I starting to feel when I want you so? Why are you so cold? When I'm around you, I want to let go. Lost in your eyes when we're moving too close, and the love we found got me upside down. And I'm gonna be with you for as long as you want, for as long as your heartaches gone. But it's a razor's edge we're standing on tonight. In a sharpened state, we're falling in love tonight. If you want my love and feel the same as I, it's a razor's edge we're standing on close to a second, we can lose it all. When lights are in motion, we're ready to fall. When I want you so, why are you so cold? 'Cause when I'm around you, I want to let go. Lost in your eyes when we're moving too close, and the love we found got me upside down.